Imagine holding a crumbling parchment in your hands, its ink faded but still whispering secrets from a world long gone. These words were once sacred, believed to hold the very keys to the afterlife, the will of the gods, or the destiny of empires. But time is not kind to meaning. Civilizations rise and fall, and with them, the truths they held dear are often rewritten, mistranslated, or buried under layers of new interpretations. What happens when a sacred text outlives the culture that birthed it? The answer is a story of loss, rediscovery, and sometimes deliberate distortion. Today, we're unraveling the fates of 28 sacred scripts texts that once guided nations, only to have their meanings twisted, hidden, or forgotten after their civilizations collapsed. Think of the Rosetta Stone, a decree meant to glorify a king, which became instead a doorway to unlocking an entire language, or the Mayan Dresden Codex, a masterpiece of astronomy and prophecy, dismissed as superstition by those who couldn't decipher its wisdom. These texts weren't just words, they were maps to the divine, instructions for living, and chronicles of the cosmos. Yet, when empires fell, conquerors and scholars alike imposed their own understandings, often stripping these scriptures of their original power. Some were burned as heresy, others were repurposed as building materials, and a few were simply lost to time, waiting centuries for someone to piece their true intent back together. This journey isn't just about ancient ink on parchment or carvings in stone. It's about how belief itself evolves, how the sacred can become mundane, and how sometimes the original voices of these texts fight their way back to the surface. From the Egyptian Book of the Dead's misunderstood spells to the Gnostic Gospels buried for 1600 years, each of these scripts carries a story of resilience. We'll decode the political agendas that rewrote them, the colonial forces that silenced them, and the modern scholars who are finally giving them back their true voices. So settle in, because history isn't just written by the winners. Sometimes it's whispered by the fragments they left behind. Civilizations don't just vanish overnight, they crumble, leaving behind fragments of their beliefs like footprints in the sand. But sacred texts, unlike temples or statues, have a peculiar fate. They don't erode with time. Instead, they're reborn in the hands of those who come after. Take the Rosetta Stone, a slab of rock inscribed with the same decree in 3 scripts. To the Ptolemaic rulers who commissioned it, it was just another political proclamation. But centuries later, it became the cipher that cracked open the secrets of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The stone didn't change, the world around it did. And that's the paradox of sacred texts. They're both timeless and endlessly malleable, shaped by whoever holds the power to interpret them. When a civilization falls, its scriptures don't just fade into obscurity. They're often caught in the crossfire of conquest, repurposed to serve new agendas. Imagine a conquering army marching into a city, seizing not just its gold but its gods. The sacred hymns of the defeated might be recast as primitive myths, their rituals labeled as superstition. Or worse, they could be twisted to legitimize the new regime. The Assyrians did this with the Babylonian Enuma Elish, swapping Marduk's name for their own god Ashur to justify their rule. It wasn't just a matter of changing words, it was a rewriting of cosmic order to fit earthly power. But distortion isn't always deliberate. Sometimes it's the quiet work of time and translation. A word misunderstood, a metaphor taken literally, a ritual stripped of its context. Each small shift layers new meaning over the old until the original intent is buried. The Vedas of ancient India, once oral hymns celebrating the harmony of the universe, were later codified into rigid rituals that reinforced social hierarchies. The egalitarian spirit of the early verses was overshadowed by rules that divided people, not because anyone set out to corrupt them, but because each generation read them through the lens of their own world. And then there are the texts that survive by hiding. The Dead Sea Scrolls were tucked away in caves, not to preserve them for future scholars, but to protect them from destruction. For centuries, they were whispers in the dark, their true purpose a guide for a secluded Jewish sect overshadowed by sensational claims of apocalyptic prophecies. It's a reminder that sacred texts aren't just words on a page, they're mirrors reflecting the fears and hopes of those who keep them. From suppression to reinvention, the journey of these scriptures reveals a universal truth: meaning is never fixed. It's a battleground, a palimpsest, a story told and retold. And as we explore these 28 transformed texts, we're not just uncovering lost interpretations, we're piecing together the fragile, ever-shifting relationship between belief and power. Picture this: a scroll of papyrus covered in intricate hieroglyphs and vivid illustrations, carefully placed in a tomb beside a mummified pharaoh. This was no ordinary book. It was a sacred roadmap, a collection of spells and incantations meant to guide the dead through the treacherous journey of the afterlife. The Egyptian Book of the Dead wasn't just a text, it was a lifeline, a way to navigate the trials of the Jewat, the shadowy underworld where souls faced judgment. But for centuries, this profound spiritual guide was misunderstood, dismissed by early archaeologists as primitive superstition, just a collection of bizarre spells and strange drawings. When European scholars first encountered these ancient scrolls in the 18th and 19th centuries, they saw them through the lens of their own prejudices. To them, the elaborate rituals and cryptic symbols seemed like little more than crude magic, the kind of thing less advanced cultures would cling to. They didn't grasp that these spells were part of a sophisticated belief system, one that saw death not as an end, but as a perilous transition. Each incantation had a purpose. Some were meant to protect the soul from demons, others to ensure the heart wouldn't betray its owner in the Hall of Judgment. The famous weighing of the heart scene, where Anubis measures a heart against the feather of Maat, wasn't just mythology, it was a moral test, a reflection of the Egyptian ideal of living a just life. The real tragedy wasn't just the misinterpretation, it was the erasure of context. The Book of the Dead wasn't a one-size-fits-all manual. Wealthy Egyptians could commission personalized versions, filled with spells tailored to their needs, while others made do with more generic copies. The spells themselves evolved over time, reflecting shifts in religious thought. Yet, early archaeologists often treated these texts as curiosities, ripping them from tombs and scattering them across museums without recording where they'd been found. Without that context, much of their deeper meaning was lost. It wasn't until the 20th century, with advances in Egyptology and linguistics, that scholars began to piece together the true significance of these texts. They realized the Book of the Dead wasn't about fear or blind ritual, it was about preparation, about equipping the soul for what came next. The Jewat wasn't just a mythical place, it was a mirror of the Egyptian understanding of the universe, where order triumphed over chaos and where the righteous could achieve eternal life. Today, we see the Book of the Dead for what it truly was: one of humanity's earliest attempts to answer the great questions of existence. What happens after we die? How do we face the unknown? The Egyptians didn't have all the answers, but their texts reveal a civilization deeply engaged with the mysteries of life and death. And that's something far more profound than mere superstition. Imagine a book so precise it could predict the movements of Venus centuries in advance, guiding entire civilizations in planting crops and holding sacred ceremonies. This wasn't some futuristic almanac, it was the Mayan Dresden Codex, a masterpiece of astronomy and mathematics, painstakingly painted on folded bark paper by scribes who saw the cosmos as a living, breathing force. Yet when Spanish missionaries laid eyes on it in the 16th century, they didn't see genius, they saw heresy. To them, these intricate charts and glyphs weren't science. They were the work of the devil, a threat to their mission of conversion. Countless Maya codices were burned in autos da fe, acts of cultural erasure disguised as piety. The Dresden Codex survived only by chance, smuggled out of the Americas, and eventually ending up in a German library where it gathered dust for centuries, its secrets locked away. What made this text so threatening? It wasn't just its content, it was what that content represented. The Maya didn't separate astronomy from spirituality. Their priests were also mathematicians, tracking the cycles of Venus not just to predict eclipses, but to determine the most auspicious times for war, coronations, and harvests. The Dresden Codex's famous Venus tables, spanning over 500 years, weren't mere calculations, they were a dialogue with the gods. The Maya believed the morning star was the warrior hero Kukulkan, whose movements could bring fortune or disaster. A misstep in timing could anger the deities, so the scribes refined their predictions down to the hour, using a numbering system that included the concept of zero, a mathematical leap Europe wouldn't make for centuries. When 20th century scholars finally cracked the Codex's complex glyphs, they uncovered a legacy of precision that stunned the academic world. The Maya had calculated Venus's synodic cycle, the time it takes to return to the same point in the sky, to within 2 hours of modern astronomy's measurements. Their eclipse tables could pinpoint celestial events decades in advance, a feat requiring generations of observation. But perhaps most tragically, they realized the Codex wasn't just a relic of the past. In the highlands of Guatemala and Mexico, Maya elders had preserved fragments of this knowledge orally, still using lunar cycles to plant maize long after the Spanish had declared such practices obsolete. The Dresden Codex's journey from sacred text to demonic artifact and back again is a story of how knowledge is lost and found, but also how it endures. The colonizers couldn't burn all of it, not really. The stars themselves kept the old rhythms, and the descendants of the scribes still looked up, remembering what the missionaries had tried to erase. Today, the Codex isn't just a museum piece. It's a testament to a civilization that mapped the heavens with nothing but patience, pigment, and the profound belief that the sky was speaking to them. Buried beneath the foundations of ancient Mesopotamian cities lies a quiet irony: thousands of clay tablets, once inscribed with hymns to the gods, crushed underfoot as mere construction rubble. The Sumerian cuneiform tablets weren't just broken, they were repurposed by later civilizations who had no idea they were walking over sacred poetry. Imagine a conqueror's wall, built to celebrate a new empire, unknowingly cemented with fragments of prayers to Enlil, the god of wind and storms. These tablets, some of humanity's earliest written words, were meant to last forever, baked hard as stone, etched with wedge-shaped symbols praising divine order and the rhythms of nature. Yet when Sumer fell, their language faded, and the hymns that once echoed in temples became illegible scratches to the invaders who followed. The loss wasn't just physical. These tablets held the Sumerians' most profound ideas, creation myths where the world emerged from primordial waters, hymns comparing the goddess Inanna to the morning star, and lamentations for cities destroyed by the god's wrath. One particularly haunting text, the Lament for Ur, describes the moment the gods abandoned the city, leaving its people to weep in the ruins. It wasn't just a historical record, it was theology in motion, a way to process collapse and find meaning in chaos. Yet for centuries, these stories lay fragmented. their phrases scattered like puzzle pieces in the walls of Babylonian palaces or the floors of Assyrian storerooms. Then came the linguists' patient scholars who, brick by brick, began reassembling the Sumerian worldview. The breakthrough wasn't just deciphering the script, it was recognizing that these weren't primitive carvings but sophisticated literature. Take the Exaltation of Inanna, a hymn where the poet Enheduanna, history's first named author, pours out her devotion to the goddess in lines that still resonate. You are the light, radiant in all lands. This wasn't just ritual, it was artistry, blending politics, spirituality, and personal emotion. Yet the tablet's survival is as much accident as design. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay endures even when it's used as filler in a road. That durability means we've recovered tens of thousands of fragments, from temple inventories to epic poetry. But here's the twist: many were preserved precisely because they were repurposed. A tablet praising a king might be recycled into a wall, only to be unearthed millennia later, its words intact but their original reverence long forgotten. Today, these hymns challenge our assumptions about ancient belief. The Sumerians didn't just fear their gods, they debated with them, praised them, even accused them of injustice. Their texts reveal a world where divinity was intertwined with daily life, where a farmer's success or a city's downfall was part of a cosmic conversation. And that's what makes their rediscovery so vital. It's not just about reclaiming lost words, but about hearing a civilization's voice again after 3,000 years of silence. For thousands of years, the verses of the Vedas weren't written down. They were carried on the breath of generations, memorized syllable by syllable, passed from teacher to student in an unbroken chain of recitation. These weren't just poems, they were vibrations, sacred sounds believed to hold the very fabric of the universe together. The earliest hymns, composed in the second millennium before the Common Era, celebrated a concept called Artie, the cosmic order that balanced seasons, stars, and human conduct in one harmonious rhythm. Rivers flowed because of Artie, the sun rose because of Artie, and in this vision, every person from farmer to chieftain had a role to play in maintaining that balance. There was no hierarchy in the original verses, only reciprocity between humanity and the cosmos. But something shifted when the oral tradition met the written word. As the Vedas were finally transcribed, likely around the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, the Brahmins, the priestly class, began to reshape them. What had been fluid hymns to the elements became rigid handbooks for ritual. The fire god Agni, once a symbol of warmth and transformation, was now a demanding deity requiring precise offerings. The Soma plant, celebrated in early verses for its role in inspiring visionary states, became the center of elaborate ceremonies only the elite could perform. Layer by layer, the Vedas accumulated commentaries called Brahmanas, which tied every syllable to specific rites, and the Upanishads, which turned philosophical but often served to reinforce priestly authority. The most profound change, though, was the slow grafting of caste onto cosmology. Early Vedic society had distinctions, but they were fluid. A skilled poet could rise in status, and warriors often held sway over priests. Yet later texts like the Purusha Sukta reimagined the universe itself as a sacrificial being whose body parts became the four Varnas: Brahmins from the mouth, warriors from the arms, merchants from the thighs, laborers from the feet. This wasn't just metaphor, it became theology used to justify social stratification as divinely ordained. The original vision of Artie, where all things worked in concert, was twisted into a pyramid with priests at the top. Yet traces of the old egalitarian spirit survived, especially in the verses themselves. The Rigveda's famous Nasadiya Sukta, a hymn about creation, ends with open-ended wonder. who really knows. The gods themselves may not know how the universe began. It's a humbling reminder that even the most ancient traditions contained room for doubt, for questions. Modern scholars have also uncovered surprising diversity in early Vedic practice, evidence of women seers called rishikas composing hymns, of lower caste groups preserving their own oral traditions. The Vedas, in other words, were never monolithic. They were a conversation, one that got narrowed over time but never fully silenced. What makes this transformation so poignant is that it wasn't sudden. Unlike texts burned by conquerors or banned as heresy, the Vedas changed through slow accretion, their meaning shifting like a river carving new channels through stone. The original hymns still exist, still chantable in the same meter as 3,000 years ago. But the world they describe, where cosmic harmony didn't require human hierarchies, feels almost like a secret waiting to be heard again. In the dry, echoing caves of Qumran, near the shores of the Dead Sea, a Bedouin shepherd tossing rocks into a dark crevice in 1947 heard something unexpected: the sound of shattering pottery. What he stumbled upon would become one of the most explosive archaeological discoveries of the 20th century: clay jars filled with ancient scrolls, their leather and papyrus texts preserved for 2,000 years by the desert's arid air. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, a library hidden in haste as Roman legions marched toward Jerusalem, their owners hoping to save their sacred writings from destruction. But when these fragile fragments first reached scholars, they sparked a wildfire of speculation, especially among early interpreters, who insisted these were prophecies of the end times, cryptic messages about cosmic battles and divine wrath. The truth, it turns out, was far more human and far more fascinating. Decades of painstaking reconstruction and translation have revealed that most of these scrolls weren't about apocalypse at all. They were the daily lifeblood of a devout Jewish sect called the Essenes, who withdrew into the wilderness to live in radical purity. Think of them as ancient monastic reformers, rejecting the corruption they saw in Jerusalem's temple and creating their own strict communal rules. The famous Community Rule scroll reads like a constitution for this separatist group, detailing everything from ritual baths to the expulsion of members who lied or lost their temper. Far from predicting doom, these texts were preoccupied with order: how to share property, settle disputes, and maintain spiritual discipline in a community that saw itself as a living temple. So how did apocalyptic myths take hold? Blame a combination of sensationalism and selective reading. Among the hundreds of scrolls, a handful, like the War Scroll, did describe a future battle between the Sons of Light and Sons of Darkness. These vivid passages stood out, especially to Christian scholars eager to link the texts to biblical prophecies about Armageddon. Never mind that the Essenes likely saw this as a symbolic struggle between good and evil, not a literal end-time scenario. The more mundane scrolls, tax records, calendars, even a bizarre copper scroll listing hidden treasure locations didn't fit the dramatic narrative, so they were sidelined. The real revelation came when researchers noticed how much the scrolls echoed and challenged mainstream Judaism of their time. The Essenes had their own version of biblical books with subtle edits that reflected their beliefs. In one Isaiah scroll, for example, a passage about God creating both light and darkness was tweaked to emphasize divine control over evil, a nod to their dualistic worldview. They also wrote commentaries reinterpreting scriptures to fit their historical moment, casting their Roman oppressors as the Kittim, a shadowy enemy from prophecy. This wasn't madness, it was resistance through theology, a way to make sense of suffering without surrendering hope. Perhaps the most poignant scroll is the Thanksgiving Hymns, a collection of poetic prayers that reveal the Essenes' emotional core. "You have purified me with your spirit," one hymn says, blending gratitude and longing. These weren't fanatics fixated on destruction. They were seekers who believed ritual purity could bring them closer to God, even as the world around them crumbled. When the Romans finally crushed the Jewish revolt in 70 CE, the Qumran community vanished, their scrolls left in caves as silent witnesses. Today, the Dead Sea Scrolls remind us how easily texts can be misread when we project our own fears onto them. The Essenes weren't forecasting doom, they were trying to build heaven on earth, one strict rule and purified meal at a time. Their legacy isn't in predictions of the end, but in the fragile, human attempt to live faithfully amid chaos. And isn't that a story we still recognize? There's a fire in the heart of Norse mythology, a blaze that consumes the world only to let it rise anew. The Poetic Edda, a collection of Viking-era poems, pulses with this rhythm of destruction and rebirth, where gods like Odin and Thor aren't just immortal beings but participants in a cosmic cycle. Ragnarök, the climactic battle where the gods fall and the world drowns in flames, wasn't a tragedy to the Skalds who first sang these verses. It was a necessity, the reset button of the universe, paving the way for a fresh earth to emerge from the sea. But when Christian scribes in medieval Iceland committed these oral traditions to parchment, they couldn't stomach such a worldview. To them, chaos without moral consequence was unthinkable. So they did what conquerors of culture often do, they rewrote the ending. Take the Völuspá, the Edda's most famous poem, where Osiris recounts the history and fate of the gods. In its original form, the prophecy is starkly beautiful. The sun darkens, stars vanish, and Odin himself is devoured by the wolf Fenrir. Yet after the cataclysm, the earth resurfaces green and fertile, and a new generation of gods inherits the golden game pieces of their predecessors. There's no judgment here, no reward or punishment, just the inevitability of cycles. But Christian copyists added their own spin. Some manuscripts insert a sudden, jarring reference to a mighty one who rules over all, a clear nod to the Christian God. Others frame the destruction as divine retribution for the gods' flaws, turning Ragnarök from a natural event into a cautionary tale about pagan folly. The distortion went deeper than a few inserted lines. Entire poems were likely omitted or altered to fit the new moral order. Loki, the trickster, got especially rough treatment. In pre-Christian lore, he was a complex figure, sometimes a villain, sometimes a helpful ally, embodying the chaos that both undermines and propels creation. But under the scribe's quills, he became a straightforward satanic analog, his mischief stripped of nuance and painted as pure evil. Even the cosmology changed. The Norse envisioned 9 interconnected worlds, with humanity's realm, Midgard, just one thread in a vast web. Christian editors, steeped in a dualistic worldview of heaven and hell, flattened this into a hierarchy, with Asgard drifting upward toward celestial imagery and Helheim sinking into a punitive underworld. Yet the old vision wasn't so easily erased. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century scholar who compiled the prose Edda, a later, more systematic retelling, admitted his Christian bias but preserved startling glimpses of the original. He describes Yggdrasil, the world tree, with roots gnawed by serpents and a squirrel running messages between the realms, details too vivid to be inventions. And despite his efforts, the cyclical heart of the myths keeps beating. When he recounts the rebirth after Ragnarök, his prose can't hide the awe of a world where even the gods aren't permanent, where endings are always beginnings in disguise. What's lost when myths are sanitized? In the case of the Edda, it's the profound acceptance of impermanence that defined Norse spirituality. The Vikings didn't fear Ragnarök, they saw it as part of the order, like winter following autumn. Their heroes sought glory not despite the world's fragility but because of it, a stark contrast to the Christian promise of eternal salvation. Today, as scholars peel back the layers of medieval editing, they're not just restoring old stories. They're reclaiming a world where destruction isn't failure but the price of renewal, and maybe that's a lesson even our modern hearts still need to hear. In the dim light of a 16th century mission, flames licked at the edges of a brightly painted manuscript, one of the few surviving copies of the Aztec Borgia Codex. To the Spanish friars who fed it to the fire, this was an act of holy duty, the destruction of idolatrous superstition. But what they burned wasn't just a collection of strange symbols, it was a masterwork of sacred timekeeping, a bridge between the celestial and the earthly. The Borgia Codex, part of a larger tradition of Mesoamerican screenfold books, wasn't merely a calendar. It was a living map of the cosmos, where every day pulsed with divine energy, and the gods themselves moved in rhythms as precise as the stars. What made this text so threatening? Unlike European calendars that tracked days for practical purposes, the Borgia Codex wove time into the fabric of spirituality. Its pages were filled with intricate Tonalpohualli, the 260-day sacred cycle that interlocked with the solar year to create a 52-year century known as the Tzumilpilli. Each day wasn't just a date, it was a confluence of forces shaped by one of 20-day signs like jaguar, wind, or rain, and 13 numbers, creating 260 unique combinations. Priests used these to determine auspicious moments for everything from planting crops to declaring war. A day under the sign of Olin or movement might be ideal for launching a journey, while one ruled by Miquistli, death, could demand caution. The Codex's vivid imagery reveals how deeply the Aztecs saw divinity in time's flow. Take the page depicting Tonatiuh, the sun god, his tongue protruding like a sacrificial knife, a reminder that each sunrise required nourishment from human hearts. Or the haunting figure of Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, whose foot, replaced with an obsidian blade, symbolized time's cutthroat inevitability. These weren't arbitrary myths, they were metaphors for cosmic balance, where human rituals maintained the universe's fragile equilibrium. Yet when missionaries like Bernardino de Sahagun recorded Aztec beliefs, they filtered them through a Christian lens. The Tonalpohualli became a demonic almanac, its complexity reduced to primitive astrology. Days linked to fertility gods were labeled as licentious. Those tied to sacrifice became proof of barbarism. Lost in translation was the underlying philosophy that time wasn't linear but cyclical, a wheel of creation and destruction where humans were active participants, not passive observers. Today, the surviving fragments of the Borgia Codex, now safeguarded in museums, tell a story of resilience. Modern scholars, collaborating with Nahua descendants, have begun to decode its layers. They've found mathematical precision in its eclipse tables and ecological wisdom in its seasonal markers. Even its dark prophecies, like the apocalyptic new fire ceremony, reveal a profound truth. The Aztecs didn't fear the end of cycles. They prepared for them, trusting renewal would follow. That's the real heresy the friars couldn't tolerate, not the blood on the altars, but the idea that time itself was sacred, and no empire, not even theirs, could stop its turning. High in the Himalayas, Tibetan monks have recited the same sacred text for centuries, not to the living, but to the newly dead. The Bardo Therdol, often called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, isn't a morbid scripture. It's a compassionate guide, whispered into the ear of a dying person to help their soul navigate the bewildering in-between state known as Bardo. Imagine being gently coached through the most profound transition a human can experience, told what visions to expect: loving deities, terrifying demons, and reminded that these are merely projections of your own mind. This was the text's original purpose, a practical manual for liberation, teaching that death, like life, is a state of consciousness to be met with awareness. Yet when Western explorers first brought the Bardo Thurdoll to Europe and America in the early 20th century, something strange happened. Its nuanced philosophy was stripped away, repackaged as a cult esoterica for spiritual seekers hungry for exotic wisdom. The result, a sacred tradition reduced to a cosmic travel guide for the spiritually curious. The distortion began with the text's very title. Bardo Thurdoll translates roughly to liberation through hearing in the intermediate state, emphasizing the transformative power of mindful listening during death's journey. But when American scholar Walter Evans Wentz published the first English translation in 1927, he rebranded it as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, deliberately echoing the Egyptian Book of the Dead to capitalize on Western fascination with ancient funerary texts. Suddenly, a profound teaching on impermanence and mental clarity became lumped in with mummies and tomb spells. Evans Wentz, a theosophist with no fluency in Tibetan, further skewed its meaning by framing it through a lens of reincarnation theories and occult symbolism that would have baffled its original authors. The actual instructions, like recognizing the clear light of death as the nature of one's own mind, were drowned out by sensational claims about astral planes and past life regression. Even more troubling was how the text's cultural roots were erased. In Tibet, the Bardo Thurdoll was never meant to be read alone. It was part of an oral tradition, chanted by trained lamas who tailored its recitation to the dying person's spiritual maturity. The terrifying, wrathful deities described in its pages weren't literal monsters but metaphors for the mind's attachments and fears, tools to jolt the deceased into recognizing their true nature. Yet Western interpreters, steeped in a love of the mysterious, fixated on these vivid images, turning them into Halloween-esque spectacles. Psychedelic pioneers like Timothy Leary further warped the text in the 1960s, comparing the bardos to drug-induced states and stripping away its ethical core. The original text's emphasis on moral preparation, cultivating compassion and wisdom in life to navigate death, was sidelined in favor of trippy, pseudo-mystical soundbites. Today, as Tibetan Buddhism gains global followers, scholars are working to reclaim the Bardo Thurdoll's true intent. Contemporary translators like Robert Thurman stress its connections to everyday mindfulness, noting how its teachings apply as much to life's small deaths, losses, transitions, crises as to physical demise. Modern hospice workers have even adapted its techniques, using its gentle prompts to help patients face terminal illness with less fear. The irony is rich. A text mangled into exoticism is now being restored as precisely what it always was, a profound, universal teaching on how to meet change with open eyes. Perhaps that's the final lesson of the Bardo Thurdoll's journey. Wisdom, no matter how displaced, always finds its way home. Before the world had shape or name, there was only chaos, a swirling, watery abyss where the gods themselves were born. The Babylonian Enuma Elish, one of humanity's oldest creation epics, begins here in the void before time. But this isn't just a myth about cosmic beginnings. It's a story of divine politics where the god Marduk's rise to power mirrors the ambitions of Babylon itself. Carved onto 7 clay tablets, the Enuma Elish wasn't merely recited in temples. It was performed during the lavish New Year festival, a spectacle celebrating Babylon's dominance. Every line, every battle between Marduk and the primordial dragon Tiamat served a dual purpose, explaining the universe's origins while legitimizing Babylon's empire as divinely ordained. Yet when the Assyrians conquered Babylon centuries later, they faced a theological dilemma. How could they rule an empire whose founding myth centered on a rival city's patron god? Their solution was as pragmatic as it was audacious. They rewrote the script, With a few strategic edits, Marduk's name vanished, replaced by Ashur, the Assyrian supreme deity. The epic's plot remained unchanged: the slaying of Tiamat, the creation of earth from her corpse, the fashioning of humans from divine blood, but its protagonist shifted to suit new rulers. This wasn't just a cosmetic change, it was a masterstroke of ideological engineering. By inserting Ashur into Marduk's role, the Assyrians transformed a Babylonian propaganda piece into a validation of their own supremacy. What's fascinating isn't just the substitution, but how seamlessly it worked. The Enuma Elish's core structure, the triumph of order over chaos, remained intact, proving how adaptable sacred narratives can be. Babylon's priests had originally crafted the epic to elevate Marduk above older Mesopotamian gods like Enlil, positioning him as the unrivaled king of the pantheon. Now, Assyrian scribes used that same framework to elevate Ashur, carefully preserving the epic's rhythms and imagery to maintain its authority. Even the number 7, sacred in Mesopotamian cosmology, stayed central. 7 tablets, 7 winds Marduk, now Ashur used to dismember Tiamat, 7 layers of the universe. The message was clear: the names might change, but the divine order endured as long as the current rulers said so. Modern scholars call this phenomenon theological imperialism, but its echoes are everywhere. Think of how Roman emperors co-opted Greek myths, rebranding Zeus as Jupiter and Aphrodite as Venus to suit their cultural agenda. The Enuma Elish's transformation reveals a universal truth: sacred stories aren't set in stone. They're living texts wielded by those in power to sanctify their rule. When archaeologists first pieced together the Assyrian version in the 19th century, they assumed it was an inferior copy. Only later did they realize its brilliance not as literature but as political theater. The Assyrians hadn't just stolen a myth, they'd hacked it, proving that the greatest power isn't just controlling land or armies, but the stories people believe about the world's very creation. Today, the Enuma Elish's dual legacy lingers in museums and libraries, its 2 versions sitting side by side. One celebrates Marduk, the other Ashur, both telling the same story of chaos tamed, but for different kings, different cities, different dreams of empire. And perhaps that's the most enduring lesson of all. Even the gods, it seems, must answer to the whims of history. Deep in the Egyptian desert, near the cliffs of Nag Hammadi, a farmer digging for fertilizer in 1945 struck something unexpected: a clay jar filled with ancient leather-bound books. Inside were 52 texts, some so fragile they crumbled at a touch. These weren't just any writings, they were the Gnostic Gospels, secret scriptures banned by the early church and buried for safekeeping 16 centuries earlier. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus that would shake scholarly assumptions to the core. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which focus on Jesus' death and resurrection, Thomas presents him as a spiritual guide, urging followers to seek the divine within. The kingdom of God is inside you, one verse insists, and all around you. This wasn't just a different take on Christianity. It was a revolution, one that threatened the very foundations of institutional power. The conflict wasn't about minor theological differences. Gnosticism, the mystical movement behind these texts, taught that salvation came not through bishops or sacraments but through gnosis, a Greek word meaning direct, personal knowledge of the divine. Imagine a version of Christianity where the path to God bypassed churches altogether, where every believer could access heavenly mysteries through introspection and revelation. To the Gnostics, the material world was a flawed creation, and the true God existed beyond it, waiting to be rediscovered in the soul's depths. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, puts it starkly: truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols. For church leaders like Irenaeus, this was dangerous thinking. If anyone could interpret scripture through personal insight, what need was there for priests, councils, or creeds? So the Gnostics were silenced. By the 4th century, as Christianity became Rome's state religion, their texts were hunted down and burned as heresy. The Nicene Creed, formulated to standardize belief, explicitly condemned gnosis as a false path. What survived was preserved only by accident, hidden in jars like the one at Nag Hammadi, or referenced in the angry polemics of their opponents. Even the name Gnostic comes from their detractors. We don't know what they called themselves. For 1600 years, their teachings existed only as fragments in the writings of church fathers who mocked them, making it nearly impossible to hear their own voices. Then came the 20th century discoveries. Suddenly, scholars had access to unmediated Gnostic thought, and the portrait that emerged was astonishingly complex. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, depicts her as Jesus' closest confidante, privy to visions the male disciples couldn't grasp. The Apocryphon of John rewrites Genesis, portraying the serpent not as a tempter but as a liberator who awakens Adam and Eve to spiritual freedom. These weren't the incoherent ramblings heresy hunters had described. They were sophisticated, poetic, and deeply philosophical. What makes the Gnostic Gospels so compelling today isn't just their alternative Christianity, but their radical insistence that divinity isn't locked away in heaven. It's here, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be recognized. That idea that the sacred might be found in the quiet spaces of the self was once enough to get a book banned for millennia. Now, as these texts resurface, they challenge us to ask, how much of spiritual history is still out there, buried in the sand or hidden between the lines of the stories we think we know? In the windswept ruins of ancient Persia, a sacred flame once burned, not just as a symbol but as a living bridge between heaven and earth. The Zoroastrian Avesta, one of the world's oldest religious texts, taught that fire was the purest manifestation of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord who waged an eternal struggle against darkness. But this wasn't a simplistic battle of good versus evil. It was a cosmic drama where every human thought and action tilted the balance. The Avesta's original teachings framed existence as a vast moral landscape, where free will was the compass and ethical choices shaped the universe itself. Yet when Islamic armies swept through Persia in the 7th century, this intricate philosophy was shattered not just by the collapse of Zoroastrian kingdoms, but by the flattening of its nuanced dualism into a crude caricature of light fighting dark. The heart of the Avesta's wisdom lay in its concept of a Shah, a cosmic order akin to truth or righteousness, constantly under siege from Drudge, the lie. But these weren't abstract forces, they were woven into daily life. A farmer tending his fields with care upheld a Shah, while a corrupt tax collector spreading false weights embodied Drudge. Even the elements played roles: water purified, fire illuminated, and earth nurtured, all allies in humanity's collective struggle. The Gathas, hymns attributed to the prophet Zarathustra, emphasized personal responsibility. Humata, Haktu, Huvashta, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, wasn't just a motto but a threefold path to align with divine will. This was a spirituality of active participation, where humans weren't pawns but co-creators of cosmic justice. Yet as Zoroastrianism retreated to isolated pockets like Yazd and Mumbai, its scriptures suffered a double fragmentation. Physical copies of the Avesta, written in the obscure Avestan language, were lost or destroyed, leaving only scattered manuscripts. More damaging was the conceptual simplification by outsiders. Early Muslim historians, encountering Zoroastrian refugees, reduced their beliefs to a Manichaean-style clash of light and dark gods, erasing the subtlety. Ahura Mazda, once a complex deity embodying wisdom and creativity, became a mere god of light, while Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, was recast as a satanic figure. The rich ethical framework, where even darkness had a purpose as the necessary contrast for free will, was boiled down to a binary even Zarathustra wouldn't recognize. Modern scholars tracing the Avesta's evolution face a puzzle. Later texts like the Bundahishan, compiled under Islamic rule, show clear signs of defensive adaptation. Angra Mainyu's role grows more sinister, while Ahura Mazda's benevolence becomes more absolute, a shift that likely reflected Zoroastrians' need to distinguish themselves from Islamic monotheism. The once fluid cosmology hardened into orthodoxy, mirroring the very dogmas it had resisted. Yet fragments of the original vision persist. In the Yasna liturgy, fire priests still recite verses that describe creation as a collaborative act, where humans and divinities labor together to renovate the world. What was lost in translation wasn't just theological nuance. It was the Avesta's radical invitation to see morality as dynamic, a dance rather than a dogma. Where later traditions often painted evil as an external force to be defeated, Zarathustra's teachings located the struggle within every choice, every moment. Today, as historians and Zoroastrian communities piece together the scattered texts, they're not just recovering a lost religion. They're reclaiming a vision of ethics that might be more vital now than ever, one where light isn't just worshipped but kindled, one deed at a time. In the warm darkness before dawn, where the ocean meets the volcanic rock of Hawaii, the Cumulipo begins not with a command, but with a sigh of life stirring in the deep. This 2,000-line chant, passed down orally for generations before being written down in the 18th century, isn't just a creation story. It's a genealogy of the cosmos, linking chiefs to gods, humans to sharks, and forests to the stars in an unbroken chain of kinship. Every syllable pulses with the idea that all life shares a single origin, the slime that clung to coral in the primordial sea, the first flicker of consciousness in the tangle of roots and tides. To the Hawaiian people, this wasn't mythology. It was science, ethics, and identity woven together. When Christian missionaries arrived in the early 19th century, they heard something very different, what they called heathenish nature worship. The Cumulipo's intimate portrayal of kinship with the natural world clashed with their belief in humanity's divinely ordained dominion over creation. The chant's opening lines, describing the birth of the coral polyp as an ancestor, seemed absurd to minds steeped in a hierarchy that placed humans atop creation. So they did what colonizers so often do: they silenced it. Hawaiian children were banned from speaking their language in mission schools, and the Cumulipo, like so much indigenous knowledge, was shoved aside as superstition. What the missionaries missed was the sophistication beneath the chant's surface. The Cumulipo unfolds in 16 wa, or epochs, mirroring the growth of an ecosystem, from the emergence of sea creatures to the intricate interdependency of land and sky. It describes the Akaka coral not as a lowly organism but as a foundational ancestor, its limestone bones building the islands themselves. The chant names over 200 species, each with a role in the cosmic family. The Mao lizards as guardians of freshwater, the Ohia lehua tree as akin to the volcano goddess Pele. This wasn't primitive animism, it was a precise ecological map, encoding observations honed over millennia of living in balance with fragile island ecosystems. The real tragedy wasn't just the suppression, it was the disconnect it created. Western science, for all its advances, often treats nature as a machine to be dissected, while the Cumulipo speaks of it as a relative to be respected. When overfishing depleted Hawaii's reefs in the 20th century, conservationists initially dismissed traditional practices like the kapu system, seasonal fishing bans, as outdated. Only decades later did marine biologists realize these primitive rules were based on intimate knowledge of spawning cycles and lunar phases, the same wisdom embedded in the Cumulippo's verses. Today, the chant is experiencing a renaissance, not as a relic but as a living text. Hawaiian scholars like Mary Kona-Pukui spent lifetimes reassembling fragmented oral traditions, while activists invoke the Cumulippo to block destructive development, arguing that desecrating the land is akin to harming a grandparent. Schools now teach children its verses not as fairy tales but as a framework for environmental ethics. The chant's most radical idea, that humans aren't above nature but of it, feels less like ancient poetry and more like urgent prophecy in an age of climate crisis. Perhaps the greatest irony is how the Cumulippo's deepest truth now echoes modern science. Ecologists speak of trophic cascades and keystone species, concepts the chant embodies in lines like, "The fish is the child of the sea / the sea is the child of the sky." What missionaries dismissed as childish fancy turns out to be a profound articulation of what we now call systems thinking, a reminder that the oldest stories sometimes hold the newest wisdom. Under the ancient oaks of Gaul and Britain, whispers of a lost spirituality rustled through the leaves, stories the Romans couldn't comprehend, so they recast them as horror. The Druids, keepers of Celtic wisdom, left no written records of their own. What we know of them comes filtered through the pens of their conquerors, men like Julius Caesar and Tacitus, who described their rituals with a mix of fascination and revulsion. A sacred grove where the Druids gathered to commune with spirits became, in Roman accounts, a dark forest drenched in human sacrifice. The seasonal festivals marking the turning of the year were twisted into lurid tales of barbarism. The truth, as modern historians and folklorists have painstakingly reconstructed, was far more profound and far less bloody. Take the infamous Wicker Man, a towering effigy Caesar claimed the Druids filled with living victims and set ablaze. Archaeological evidence suggests this was likely Roman propaganda, a grotesque exaggeration designed to justify conquest. What the Celts actually revered were natural cycles, solstices, equinoxes, the sacred geometry of mistletoe growing on oak. Their sacrifices were more likely offerings of grain, herbs, or symbolic objects, rituals meant to maintain harmony with the land. The Druids weren't priests of cruelty, but philosophers who memorized decades of oral lore, astronomers who tracked the stars without instruments, and mediators who settled disputes without violence. Their power came not from the sword but from the word, and that's precisely why Rome feared them enough to slander them. The distortion didn't end with antiquity. Centuries later, Victorian-era romanticizers added another layer of myth, portraying Druids as white-robed mystics chanting at Stonehenge, a site they likely never used. This sanitized version was just as misleading as the Roman horror stories, stripping the Druids of their authentic connection to tribal life, where every river had a spirit and every tree might house a god. Modern scholars, piecing together clues from archaeology, medieval Irish and Welsh texts, and surviving folk customs, have uncovered a spirituality deeply rooted in reciprocity. The Celts didn't dominate nature, they spoke to it. A Druid's prayer wasn't a demand but a conversation with the wind, the stag, the standing stone. Perhaps the most poignant correction to the record involves the concept of the otherworld. Roman writers framed it as a shadowy realm of dread, but Celtic lore describes it as a parallel dimension of vibrant feasts and eternal youth, accessible through portals like fairy mounds or sudden mists. The dead weren't tortured souls but ancestors feasting alongside gods, their presence woven into daily life. This wasn't primitive superstition, It was a sophisticated cosmology where time moved in spirals, not lines, and every action echoed in both worlds. Today, the Druids' legacy lingers in unexpected places. The Welsh word orn, meaning poetic inspiration, survives in bardic traditions, while the Irish festival of Samhain, once a harvest rite honoring the dead, echoes in our Halloween. Even the reverence for sacred trees finds resonance in modern environmental movements. The real tragedy isn't just that the Druids were silenced, it's that we almost lost their most radical idea, that the earth itself is alive, and wisdom grows not in scrolls, but in the quiet spaces between root and rain. In the bustling markets of ancient India, Jain monks walked barefoot, sweeping the ground before each step to avoid crushing even the tiniest insect. This wasn't mere ritual, it was the living embodiment of ahimsa, a principle so radical it extended compassion to every breath of life, from the cobra in the grass to the microbes in a drop of water. The Jain Agamas, scriptures compiled over 2 millennia ago, didn't just preach non-violence, they mapped it as a cosmic law where harm to any creature reverberated through the soul's journey. Yet as Hinduism and Buddhism rose to dominance, Jainism's uncompromising ethics were pushed to the margins, dismissed as impractical fanaticism rather than recognized as one of history's most profound experiments in universal empathy. The Agama's vision of ahimsa went far beyond vegetarianism or pacifism. Texts like the Acharanga Sutra laid out meticulous rules. Monks couldn't light fires after sunset to avoid burning unseen insects, drink unfiltered water to prevent swallowing life forms, or even pluck fruit from trees to spare the plant's pain. To modern eyes, these might seem excessive, but their logic was startlingly consistent. If all life, even a blade of grass, contained a soul jiva, then violence wasn't just a moral failing but a karmic pollutant weighing down spiritual progress. Jainism's 5 great vows elevated non-violence to the same level as truth and chastity, making it the foundation of enlightenment. Yet this radicalism came at a cost. While Buddhism's middle way and Hinduism's Bhagavad Gita offered more flexible paths, Jainism's absolutism made it difficult to scale. Kings admired its ethics but rarely adopted it as state policy, fearing its strictures would paralyze agriculture, trade, or defense. Even Jainism's own laity, though devout, couldn't fully embrace monastic extremes. The Agamas themselves acknowledged this tension, creating tiers of observance where householders practiced modified ahimsa while monks pursued perfection. Over time, this bifurcation allowed Hinduism and Buddhism to absorb Jain ideas, like vegetarianism, while sidelining the tradition itself as a fringe ascetic sect. The marginalization wasn't just political, it was philosophical. Hindu texts like the Mahabharata often portrayed ahimsa as situational, permissible to violate in war or duty. Buddhist scriptures, while valuing compassion, focused more on mental purification than physical non-harm. But the Jain Agamas refused compromise. Their Tattva Sutra declared that violence with intent, even in self-defense, was still violence. This unyielding stance fascinated scholars like Mahatma Gandhi, who adapted Jain principles into his Satyagraha movement, yet even he struggled with their absolutism. What's often overlooked is how prescient the Agamas were. Their classification of life forms, from single-sensed beings like plants to 5-sensed animals, mirrors modern biology's complexity scales. Their prohibition on night farming to avoid killing nocturnal creatures anticipates today's ecological mindfulness. Even their concept of Syadvada, the idea that truth is multifaceted and all statements should be qualified with maybe, feels eerily postmodern. Today, as Jainism's influence quietly permeates global movements, From animal rights to environmentalism, the Agamas challenge our hierarchies of compassion. They ask, how far are we willing to extend the circle of moral concern? And in a world fraying from climate collapse and mass extinction, their extremism suddenly seems less like a relic and more like a revelation. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where the Blue Nile carves its path through ancient rock, a sacred text weaves together scripture and sovereignty, the Kebra Nagast, or Glory of Kings. At its heart lies a story so potent it shaped a nation's identity, the legendary union between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, from whom Ethiopian emperors claimed direct descent. But this wasn't just a royal genealogy, it was a theological thunderbolt asserting that God's covenant had shifted from Jerusalem to Axum and that Ethiopia's rulers were divinely chosen. Over centuries, however, the Kebra Nagast's spiritual core, its themes of grace, humility, and divine favor, was overshadowed by emperors who wielded it as a coronation manual, twisting its sacred narrative into a tool of unchallengeable authority. The text's most audacious claim centers on Menelik, the son supposedly born to Solomon and Sheba. According to the Kebra Nagast, Menelik traveled to Jerusalem as a young man and returned home with a staggering treasure, the Ark of the Covenant, smuggled out of Solomon's temple by divine will. From that moment, the story goes, Ethiopia became the new Zion, its kings anointed as guardians of the Ark and heirs to David's throne. This wasn't merely folklore, it was a cosmic realignment of sacred geography. The Kebra Nagast's early passages resonate with lyrical spirituality, describing how God's favor flowed like a river from Israel to Ethiopia, not through conquest but through a promise, a covenant renewed. Yet by the medieval period, the text's deeper message had been eclipsed by political pragmatism. Emperors like Amda Seyon and Zara Yacob invoked the Kebra Nagast to justify their absolute rule, portraying dissent as sacrilege. The Ark, said to reside in Axum's Church of St. Mary of Zion, became a symbol of imperial invincibility, off limits to all but a single guardian monk. The text's original emphasis on divine grace, how Solomon, despite his wisdom, fell from favor through pride, while the humble Queen of Sheba was exalted, faded beneath layers of dynastic propaganda. Ethiopia's rulers weren't just kings, they were Solomonic reincarnations, their authority beyond question. What makes this transformation so striking is how it mirrors the Bible's own political journey. Just as King David's Psalms of penitence were later used to sanctify his descendants' power, the Kebra Nagast's spiritual insights were co-opted to serve earthly ambition. Modern scholars digging into its jazz verses have uncovered neglected passages where the Queen of Sheba debates theology with Solomon, outmatching his cleverness with her wisdom, a nod to Ethiopia's long tradition of female leadership. Other sections stress that true glory comes not from lineage but from piety, a radical idea in a society where bloodlines dictated destiny. Today, the Kebra Nagast endures as both scripture and cultural touchstone. During Ethiopia's turbulent 20th century, Haile Selassie wielded its Solomonic claims to resist colonial powers, even as critics accused him of ignoring its calls for justice. Meanwhile, Rastafarians reinterpreted the text, seeing Selassie himself as the messianic fulfillment of its prophecies, a twist the medieval scribes could never have imagined. The Kebra Nagast's journey, from spiritual manifesto to political weapon and back again, reminds us that no sacred text is safe from the hands of those who would use it to crown themselves. But neither can its original light ever be fully extinguished. Somewhere beneath the layers of imperial gloss, the voice of the Queen still whispers, "True glory belongs not to kings, but to the humble who seek it." In the forests of Eastern Europe, where old gods once whispered through the birch trees, a controversial text emerged in the 19th century, the Slavic Vedas, a collection of writings claiming to be the lost scriptures of ancient Slavs. Purportedly rediscovered on wooden tablets, these verses spoke of Perun the thunder god, Veles the trickster, and a golden age of Slavic spirituality before Christianity's arrival. But here's the twist: most scholars agree these texts weren't ancient at all. They were likely crafted by Romantic-era nationalists, eager to give Slavic cultures a mythology as grand as the Norse Eddas or Greek epics. Yet despite their dubious origins, the Slavic Vedas took on a life of their own, becoming sacred to modern pagan revival movements desperate to reconnect with a past that colonization and conversion had erased. The allure of these texts lies in the void they filled. For centuries, Slavic paganism survived only in fragments, folktales about Baba Yaga's hut, harvest rituals disguised as Christian feast days, the persistent veneration of household spirits called domovoi. Unlike Scandinavia or Greece, the Slavs had no medieval scribes to preserve their pre-Christian beliefs. Their stories were passed down orally, vulnerable to distortion and loss. When the Slavic Vedas appeared, offering a seemingly complete pantheon and cosmology, they became a rallying point for those seeking to reclaim an identity crushed by empires. Never mind that the text's language bore suspicious resemblances to 19th century poetic styles, or that their ancient symbols mirrored Masonic imagery. For believers, they were proof that Slavic spirituality hadn't been erased, just waiting to be uncovered. This phenomenon isn't unique to the Slavs. The 19th century saw a boom in rediscovered texts, from the Ossian poems in Scotland to the Book of Mormon in America. What sets the Slavic Vedas apart is how they reflect a broader cultural ache, the longing of marginalized peoples to anchor themselves in a glorified past. Modern Rodnovery, the Slavic pagan revival, often cites these texts as inspiration, even as academic researchers debunk them. The Vedas' descriptions of communal rituals under sacred oaks, of gods who personified natural forces, resonate with environmental movements seeking alternatives to Abrahamic traditions. In a way, the text's authenticity matters less than their function. They're a mirror reflecting contemporary desires more than ancient truths. Yet the Slavic Vedas also raise uneasy questions. When Latvia's Devchariba movement or Russia's Ingelism sect used these texts to justify nationalist agendas, the line between cultural revival and myth-making blurs. Some versions of the Vedas promote xenophobic ideals, portraying Slavic ancestors as a superior race, a distortion that says more about modern politics than prehistoric beliefs. This is the double-edged sword of invented traditions. They can empower, but they can also manipulate. Perhaps the real lesson of the Slavic Vedas isn't about the past at all, but about how hunger for belonging can turn even forgeries into scripture. In a world where identity feels increasingly fragile, sometimes the most powerful myths are the ones we choose to believe, regardless of their origins. And that, in itself, is a kind of magic. Beneath the cracks of ancient tortoise shells, a king's advisors once traced the future. These fissures, formed when heat touched bone, weren't just random fractures, they were messages from the unseen world, patterns to be decoded into wisdom. This was the birth of the I Ching, or Book of Changes, a Zhou dynasty oracle that began as a ruler's toolkit for navigating chaos. Unlike modern tarot cards or horoscopes, its original purpose wasn't personal fortune-telling but statecraft, a way to align human decisions with the cosmic order of heaven and earth. The 64 hexagrams, those stacked lines of broken and unbroken bars, weren't abstract symbols but reflections of natural phenomena: thunderstorms over mountains, lakes beneath fire, winds stirring the waters. To consult the I Ching was to seek the universe's feedback on whether to wage war, plant crops, or marry dynasties. Then came Confucius, who in the 6th century before the Common Era reshaped the text into something new. Where Zhu Divinus saw practical omens, the philosopher saw ethical instruction. He reportedly said if he had 50 years to spare, he'd devote them all to studying the I Ching, not for its predictive power, but for its embodiment of the superior man's virtues. The 10 Wings, commentaries traditionally attributed to Confucius or his disciples, transformed the hexagrams into lessons on moral integrity. Hexagram 15, Modesty, became a guide to humility in leadership. Hexagram 37, The Family, outlined patriarchal duties. The I Ching's shift from royal divination to Confucian classic was so complete that by the Han Dynasty, it stood at the head of China's 5 classics, required reading for scholars taking civil service exams. Its original context, a volatile world of shifting alliances and omens, faded beneath layers of philosophical gloss. Centuries later, the text crossed oceans and shed another skin. When German sinologist Richard Wilhelm translated the I Ching into English in the 1920s, his version, endorsed by Carl Jung, became a counterculture sensation in the West. Suddenly, the hexagrams were less about statecraft or ethics than personal growth and Jungian synchronicity. Silicon Valley executives tossed coins to brainstorm startups, hippies used it to navigate love lives, and New Age workshops marketed it as a self-help manual. The cosmic balance between yin and yang, once a framework for harmonizing kingdoms, became shorthand for balancing one's chakras. What got lost in these reinventions? The Zhou dynasty's profound sense of interdependence, the idea that a ruler's choices rippled through the natural world. Hexagram 11, Peace, didn't just mean inner tranquility. It described the rare celestial alignment when heaven and earth communed, a time to enact bold reforms. Hexagram 12, Stagnation, warned of blocked energies in both governance and harvests. Modern users flipping coins for career advice might miss the original stakes. This was a text born from the belief that human folly could trigger droughts or floods. Yet the I Ching's fluidity is also its genius. Unlike scriptures carved in stone, it welcomes reinterpretation, allowing each era to find its own truths in the hexagram's patterns. Today, physicists compare its binary-like lines to computer code, while ecologists see it as an early systems theory. Perhaps that's the ultimate irony. A manual for reading cosmic balance became unbalanced by history, only to prove its core thesis: change is the only constant. Deep in the highlands of Guatemala, where mist curls around volcanic peaks, a sacred book survived conquest. But not unchanged. The Popol Vuh, the Maya Kayich people's epic of creation, was never meant to be written down. Its stories of gods shaping the world from corn dough and hero, twins outwitting the lords of the underworld, were oral traditions, passed through generations in the rhythmic cadence of elders' voices. Then came Francisco Ximenes, a Dominican friar stationed in Chichicastenango around 1700. Tasked with converting the Maya, he did something radical. He transcribed their sacred stories, but with a twist. His handwritten manuscript, the earliest surviving version of the Popol Vuh, sandwiched the Kayich text between Spanish translations, subtly weaving Christian themes into the ancient narrative. What began as a cosmic tale of resilience became, in his hands, a parable of sin and salvation. The original Popol Vuh pulsed with a distinctly Mayan worldview. Its opening lines describe a silent, empty universe where the gods Tepu and Gukumats conjure life through spoken word, not unlike Genesis, yet profoundly different. Here, creation isn't a one-time act but a series of experiments. The gods fashion humans from mud too brittle, then wood soulless, before perfecting them from corn, the sacred staple of Mesoamerican life. The hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, don't battle evil. They outwit the death gods of Xibalba through cleverness and ballgame prowess, resurrecting their father and unlocking May's secret to sustain humanity. This wasn't just mythology, it was a map of existence where death wasn't an end but a phase, and humanity's purpose was tied to the Earth cycles. Ximenes' version, though invaluable for preservation, reframed these ideas through a Catholic lens. Where the KH text describes the gods' deliberations as collaborative, his Spanish gloss introduces hierarchical language, implying a supreme creator akin to the Christian God. The hero twins' descent into Xibalba, originally a metaphor for agricultural cycles. Seed dies in soil to sprout anew, takes on shades of Christ's harrowing of hell. Most strikingly, the Maze-born humans celebrated in the original for their connection to the land are reinterpreted as flawed beings needing spiritual redemption. These weren't clumsy mistranslations, they were theological grafts reshaping the story to fit colonial dogma, yet the Popol Vuh refused to be fully tamed. Between Ximenes' lines, the old worldview endures, the very act of recording it, against church directives to destroy indigenous texts, suggests even the friar felt its power. Modern scholars, comparing his manuscript with surviving oral traditions, spot telltale gaps where Christian edits strain against the narrative's original logic. Why, for instance, would sinful, May's humans be the gods' final, triumphant design? Why do the twins resurrect not through divine intervention but ritual knowledge, a distinctly Mayan concept? Today, the Popol Vuh lives in two worlds. Academics debate its authentic version, while Maya communities in Guatemala recite fragments at ceremonies, blending pre-Hispanic and Catholic elements into a living tradition. Its hero twins adorn murals as symbols of indigenous resilience, and its Corn People origin story fuels movements for land rights. The text's journey from oral epic to colonized manuscript to reclaimed manifesto mirrors the Maya themselves, adaptable yet unbroken, their sacred stories still whispering truths no translation could erase. In the bustling markets of 7th century Medina, a question hung in the air like desert heat: how could the community preserve the Prophet Muhammad's teachings after his passing? Unlike the Quran, believed by Muslims to be God's direct revelation, Muhammad's everyday sayings and actions known as hadiths existed only in memory. Tie your camel first, then trust in God, he'd advised, blending practicality with piety. But as decades passed and Islam spread across continents, these oral traditions multiplied like branches on a tree, some genuine, others distorted by time or politics. What emerged wasn't just a collection of spiritual guidance, but a battleground where authenticity and authority collided, reshaping Islam's future. The earliest hadith collectors worked like human archives, traveling thousands of miles to verify accounts through chains of narrators called isnads. A single saying might trail back through 5 generations. I heard from A, who heard from B, who heard from the Prophet. But herein lay the crisis. As the Islamic Empire expanded under the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, rulers realized controlling hadiths meant controlling the faith itself. Suddenly, suspiciously convenient traditions appeared, justifying everything from tax policies to military campaigns. One notorious example is the Hadith of the Ink Pot, where Muhammad supposedly said, "Bring me a writing tablet so I may prevent you from going astray," a saying championed by Abbasid caliphs to assert their right to interpret religious law. Never mind that many scholars questioned its authenticity. It served power, so it spread, yet resistance flickered in the shadows. Scholars like al-Bukhari and Muslim Ibn al-Hajjaj spent lifetimes sifting through hundreds of thousands of hadiths, accepting only a fraction as sahih or authentic. Their criteria were rigorous: a narrator's moral character, their proximity to the Prophet corroborating accounts, But even this wasn't foolproof. The famous Satanic Verses incident, where Muhammad was falsely said to have momentarily recognized pagan goddesses to ease tensions in Mecca, slipped into early histories before being rejected. The line between divine truth and political fabrication grew dangerously thin. What's often overlooked is how these debates marginalized alternative voices. The Mu'tazilites, a rationalist school, argued that hadiths contradicting reason should be discarded, a view embraced by the Abbasid Caliph Al-Ma'mun until he enforced it brutally through inquisitions. Sufi mystics who prioritized direct spiritual experience over textual literalism saw many of their teachings labeled as heretical. Even Aisha, the Prophet's wife and a key hadith transmitter, found her critiques of male companions' accounts downplayed in official collections. The canon that emerged wasn't just about truth, it was about whose truth counted. Modern scholars still grapple with this legacy. Contemporary hadith critics use digital databases to analyze narrator networks like forensic scientists, spotting patterns of forgery. Meanwhile, reformists urge focusing on the Quran's universal principles over contested traditions. Yet in villages from Morocco to Indonesia, hadiths remain living texts, invoked in everything from court rulings to parenting advice. Their journey from whispered recollections to weaponized dogma holds a mirror to all scripture. The moment words are written, power writes itself between the lines. Buried beneath the sands of Thebes, a crumbling papyrus held whispers of forbidden knowledge, spells to summon gods, cure lovesickness, and even compel the dead to speak. The Theban Magical Papyri, a sprawling collection of Greek and Egyptian rituals from the first few centuries of the Common Era, wasn't the work of dark sorcerers but of everyday people, doctors, priests, even farmers, seeking divine intervention in a chaotic world. What made these texts so threatening to later Christian authorities wasn't just their content, but their fearless blending of traditions. Here, the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth merged into a single figure, Hermes Trismegistus, a patron of magic and wisdom. Invocations to Apollo sat alongside hymns to Isis, and Hebrew divine names tangled with Coptic charms. This wasn't heresy to the people who used it. It was spiritual pragmatism, a reflection of Egypt's multicultural crossroads. Yet by the Middle Ages, these papyri had been recast as manuals of demonic summoning. Medieval clerics, encountering fragments preserved in monastic libraries or traded by Arabic scholars, saw only corruption. The very syncretism that made the spells powerful to their original users, their ability to weave together different cultures' understandings of the divine, became proof of their wickedness. A prayer that invoked both Christ and Osiris, blasphemy. A love charm calling on Selene, the moon goddess, alongside angels, devilry. The Church's discomfort wasn't just theological, it was political. The papyri represented a world where spiritual authority wasn't centralized, where individuals could access the sacred without intermediaries. That kind of independence threatened the very foundations of medieval power structures. Modern scholars have peeled back the layers of fear to reveal something far more nuanced. The so-called magic in these texts often resembled medicine recipes for salves to treat fever or rituals to ease childbirth. One spell, designed to cure migraines, instructed the sufferer to wear a carved gemstone depicting a lion-headed god while reciting a formula blending Greek and Egyptian phrases. Was this superstition or an early form of holistic healing? Another fragment, a guide to dream interpretation, mixed Babylonian astrology with local folk remedies. The papyri's true transgression wasn't trafficking with demons. It was refusing to acknowledge boundaries between religions, between science and spirituality, between high theology and street-level faith. The most fascinating aspect of these texts is how they mirror contemporary anxieties about cultural mixing. Just as some today fear syncretism dilutes pure traditions, the medieval church saw the papyri as a dangerous contamination. Yet the original users likely didn't see themselves as rebels. For them, invoking Thoth and Hermes together wasn't sacrilege, it was common sense. If both gods governed wisdom, why wouldn't their powers combine? This fluidity extended to language itself. Coptic, Greek, and Demotic Egyptian swirled together in the incantations, suggesting that the word's potency came from their resonance, not their doctrinal purity. Today, as scholars digitize and reconstruct the papyri, they're uncovering a lost ethos, one where magic wasn't dark or light, but a tool for navigating life's uncertainties. The real tragedy isn't that these texts were demonized, but that their legacy of spiritual creativity was nearly erased. In a world increasingly polarized between rigid orthodoxies, the Theban magical papyri offer a radical reminder. Sometimes the most powerful magic happens at the intersections. Imagine sitting on the windswept shores of Easter Island, holding a wooden tablet carved with rows of intricate glyphs, birds, plants, figures with outstretched arms, all arranged in a mysterious, rhythmic sequence. This is Rongorongo, the undeciphered script of the Rapa Nui people, one of the few independent writing systems to emerge in human history. Unlike the hieroglyphs of Egypt or the cuneiform of Mesopotamia, Rongorongo's symbols remain stubbornly untranslated, their meanings locked away because the key, the last fluent readers, vanished in the chaos of colonial violence. These glyphs may have held creation chants, genealogies of gods, or navigational wisdom for crossing the Pacific. But today, they're a haunting puzzle, a library of sacred knowledge with no one left to read it aloud. The tragedy of Rongorongo isn't just its undeciphered state, it's how close we came to preserving it. When European missionaries arrived on Easter Island in the 1860s, they noted elders chanting as they traced the glyphs with their fingers, suggesting the script was more than decoration. It was a mnemonic device for reciting oral traditions. But within a decade, slave raids from Peru decimated the island's population, carrying off nearly half its people, including many of the script's keepers. Diseases introduced by outsiders wiped out more. By the time scholars like Bishop Jawson tried to document Rongorongo in the 1880s, only a handful of aging islanders remembered fragments of its context, and none could fully interpret the texts. The missionaries, dismissing the glyphs as pagan curios, collected the tablets as souvenirs. Some even repurposed them as garden planks or firewood. What makes Rongorongo so tantalizing is its uniqueness. Most writing systems evolve from contact with other cultures, but Easter Island is the most isolated inhabited place on Earth, over 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. The script's symbols, fishhooks, frigate birds, crescent moons reflect the island's ecology, yet their arrangement hints at a sophisticated structure. Some glyphs repeat in patterns that suggest poetry or song, while others appear in sequences that might record astronomical cycles or clan histories. A few researchers, like linguist Stephen Fisher, claim partial decipherment, linking certain glyphs to lunar calendars or genealogical lists. But without a Rosetta Stone, a bilingual text to bridge Rongorongo and a known language, theories remain speculative. The closest analogies are Polynesian chants like the Hawaiian Kumulipo, where nature and ancestry intertwine, but even these are imperfect guides. The silence of Rongorongo carries a deeper warning about cultural fragility. Other lost scripts like Linear of Crete or the Indus Valley symbols faded gradually over centuries. Rongorongo's erasure was abrupt, a casualty of greed and indifference. Modern Rapa Nui activists are now reclaiming their heritage, reviving traditional chants and dances that might hold echoes of the glyphs' original meanings. Meanwhile, scientists use 3D imaging to study the tablet's grooves, searching for clues in the angle of each carved line. The glyphs may yet speak, but if they do, their message will be fragmented, like a voice calling across the ocean from a shore we can no longer reach. In the quiet tombs of ancient Etruria, a sacred text was meant to guide the dead through the afterlife, written not on fragile papyrus or clay, but on linen, a fabric chosen to endure. The Liber Linteus, or Linen Book, stood as one of the rarest relics of the Etruscan civilization, its crimson ink spelling out rituals and prayers to deities like Tinia, the thunder god, and Uni, the mother goddess. These weren't generic blessings, they were precise instructions for funeral rites, celestial navigation, and offerings to ensure safe passage. Yet today, this extraordinary manuscript survives in fragments not because time eroded it, but because someone thousands of miles away found a practical use for its fabric. When the Romans absorbed Etruria into their empire, the Liber Linteus vanished, only to reappear centuries later in the most unlikely of places, wrapped around an Egyptian mummy in a crocodile god's temple. The irony is almost poetic. The Egyptians, masters of preserving the dead, unwittingly erased another culture's death rituals by repurposing their sacred text as mummy bandages. In 1848, a Croatian official named Mihajlo Baric purchased the linen-wrapped mummy from Alexandria, displaying it as a curiosity in his home. It wasn't until a visitor noticed strange markings on the wrappings that scholars realized the strips weren't just plain cloth. They bore the longest surviving Etruscan text ever found. The very material meant to honor the dead had become a nameless shroud, its words sliced into disjointed ribbons by hands that couldn't read them. Deciphering the Liber Linteus has been a puzzle wrapped in layers of tragedy. Etruscan, unlike Latin or Greek, has no close linguistic relatives, and most of its literature was lost during Rome's cultural assimilation. The surviving passages, pieced together like a jigsaw, revealed tantalizing glimpses of a sophisticated spiritual tradition. One section lists dates for offerings to the gods, aligning with lunar cycles. Another describes a ceremonial procession, possibly for a funeral. But without the full context destroyed when the linen was cut, the text's deeper theology remains just out of reach. Imagine tearing pages from a hymn book, then trying to reconstruct the entire religion from a handful of verses. What makes this loss especially poignant is what it says about cultural memory. The Etruscans themselves were meticulous record keepers, borrowing the Greek alphabet to document everything from trade contracts to prophecies. Yet their conquerors, the Romans, who admired Etruscan divination practices enough to adopt their haruspices' liver-reading priests, let their texts crumble. The Liber Linteus might have been one of hundreds, perhaps even a standard funerary text, but now it's a solitary survivor. Its words fragmented not by time's gentle decay, but by the casual reuse of a civilization that didn't recognize their value. Today, the reassembled fragments sit in Zagreb's Archaeological Museum, a ghostly testament to how easily knowledge can unravel. The mummy, once the pride of a private collection, is now an afterthought, just the vehicle that accidentally preserved a text far older than itself. In a way, the Liber Linteus's journey mirrors the Etruscans' own fate, absorbed, repurposed, and nearly erased, yet still whispering secrets to those willing to listen closely. Its legacy isn't just in the words we can read, but in the stark reminder that history isn't just written by the victors. It's also wrapped around their artifacts, waiting to be unwound. In the deserts of 3rd century Persia, a new faith arose with a vision so stark it threatened the foundations of every empire it touched: Manichaeism. Its founder, the prophet Mani, preached a universe divided not by gods and mortals, but by two primal forces: light, the essence of spirit and goodness, and darkness, the trap of matter and desire. The Manichaean Psalms, sung by followers from the Silk Road to North Africa, wove this cosmic struggle into poetry of breathtaking beauty. I am a wandering soul, one hymn lamented, a spark of light trapped in the prison of the flesh. Yet these luminous verses, meant to guide souls back to the realm of light, were systematically hunted down and burned as heresy, first by Zoroastrian priests, then Christian emperors, and finally Islamic caliphs. What fragments remain, scattered from Turfan to Cairo, tell a story not of simple dualism, but of a profound harmony where even darkness had purpose in the divine plan. Augustine of Hippo, before his conversion to Christianity, spent nearly a decade as a Manichaean hearer, one of the faith's lay followers. His later writings, like Against Faustus, would become the lens through which most of Europe viewed Manichaeism, and it was a distorting lens. Where Mani's hymns described darkness as a chaotic force that had mingled with light by accident, requiring purification, Augustine recast it as Satan's eternal rebellion. The subtle Manichaean concept of suffering as a refining fire where souls slowly extracted themselves from material existence became, in Augustine's polemics, a cartoonish war between heaven and hell. This caricature stuck, influencing everything from medieval witch hunts to modern fantasy tropes. The Psalms' original nuance, where light and darkness were locked in a dance rather than a death match, was erased beneath layers of heresiological propaganda. The surviving fragments reveal what was lost. A hymn discovered in the caves of Dunhuang, China, addresses the living spirit, a divine figure who builds the cosmos as a mechanism to filter light from darkness. You made the wheels of wind and fire slash to sift the sparks from the ashes of the world. Another, preserved in Coptic translation, speaks of the cross of light, not as an instrument of torture but as a symbol of the soul's journey, not wood but wisdom. These weren't the ravings of devil worshippers but sophisticated meditations on the human condition, blending Christian, Buddhist, and Gnostic imagery into something entirely new. Modern scholars piecing together these texts face a dilemma. The largest cache, the Medinet Madi Library found in Egypt in 1929, was split between collectors, its pages scattered across Berlin, Dublin, and Warsaw. A single psalm might exist as a Coptic fragment in one museum, a Sogdian translation in another, and a quotation in an anti-Manichaean treatise elsewhere. Reconstructing them is like assembling a stained glass window from shattered panes. Some sections glow vividly, while others remain opaque. Yet even these partial glimpses challenge Augustine's legacy. The Psalms don't vilify the material world. They mourn it as a fallen paradise where light lies dormant, like gold in the mine, like wine in the grape. The tragedy of the Manichaean Psalms isn't just their physical destruction, it's how their erasure narrowed the spiritual imagination of the West. In reducing Mani's vision to a simplistic good versus evil fable, we lost a tradition that could have offered a third way between the harsh dualisms of orthodoxy and the vague monisms of New Age thought. The Psalms' greatest heresy, perhaps, was their insistence that darkness wasn't evil just lost, waiting to be transformed, and in a world still gripped by binary thinking, that might be the most dangerous idea of all. Buried in a gravel quarry near the Gulf of Mexico, a single slab of serpentine stone holds the key to a mystery older than the Maya or the Aztecs, the Cascajal block, carved with 62 enigmatic symbols by the Olmec people over 3,000 years ago. This palm-sized tablet isn't just the oldest known writing in the Americas. It's a ghostly echo of a civilization so foundational that later Mesoamerican cultures called them the Rubber People, the inventors of the sacred ball game and the builders of colossal stone heads. Yet despite its staggering significance, the block's glyphs remain stubbornly untranslatable. their meaning locked away because the Olmecs left no Rosetta Stone, no descendant culture to preserve their language. What we're left with is a tantalizing glimpse of a spiritual world that might have shaped everything from Mayan calendars to Aztec blood rituals, if only we could read it. The symbols themselves are a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. Unlike later Mesoamerican scripts that evolved into full writing systems, the Cascabel block's glyphs seem to hover between art and language, some resembling cornstalks or insects, others abstract swirls reminiscent of the Olmec's iconic jaguar motifs. A few symbols repeat in clusters, suggesting they might represent words or concepts rather than just decorative patterns. One theory posits that the block could be a dedicatory inscription for a temple, perhaps invoking the Olmec rain god or the jaguar deity who bridged the earthly and spiritual realms. Another suggests it's a ritual calendar, tracking sacred cycles that later cultures would elaborate into the famous long count system. But without more samples, only a handful of Olmec glyphs have been found beyond this stone. These remain educated guesses. What makes the block's silence so profound is the Olmec's outsized influence on everything that came after them. Their art and architecture seeped into the DNA of Mesoamerica. The Maya inherited their ball games' cosmic symbolism, the Zapotecs borrowed their temple layouts, and the Aztecs collected Olmec artifacts as relics of a legendary past. Even the concept of divine kingship rulers claiming descent from gods may have originated with them. The Cascabel block could be the missing link explaining how these ideas were transmitted, not just through oral tradition but through sacred texts. Imagine if the Judeo-Christian world had lost the Ten Commandments, knowing only that Moses once carried tablets down a mountain. That's the scale of what's at stake here. The tragedy isn't just the loss of translation, it's the erasure of context. The block was discovered in the 1990s by road builders, its original archaeological setting destroyed by machinery. Without knowing where it sat, whether in a temple, a tomb, or a marketplace, we lack clues to its purpose. Modern linguists face a chicken and egg problem. To crack the code, they'd need more examples of Olmec writing, but finding those examples requires knowing what to look for. It's like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a single measure of music, yet there's hope in the block's very existence. Its discovery shattered the long-held assumption that Mesoamerican writing began with the Maya around 300 BC. Now we know scribes were carving symbols centuries earlier, in the heart of Olmec cities like La Venta and San Lorenzo. Every undeciphered glyph is a reminder that history isn't a straight line. It's a palimpsest with older layers waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere in those cryptic curves and lines, the Olmecs might still be speaking, if we could only learn to listen. In the sun-baked ruins of Phaistos, a palace overlooking Crete's fertile Messara plain, archaeologists unearthed a clay disc that would become one of history's most tantalizing riddles. The Phaistos disc, roughly the size of a small plate and stamped on both sides with spiraling symbols of men, birds, and strange geometric shapes, looks almost modern in its precision. Each impression pressed into the clay with individual seals, like an ancient form of movable type. But this artifact isn't from the age of printing presses. It dates back to the Middle Minoan period, around 1700 before the Common Era, a time when Crete's labyrinthine palaces thrived and its goddess-worshipping culture dominated the Aegean. What makes the disc so maddeningly opaque isn't just the undeciphered script, it's the fact that no other example of this writing has ever been found. Unlike Linear A, the Minoan administrative script that appears on hundreds of tablets, the Phaistos disc stands alone, a solitary utterance from a world we can barely hear. The symbols themselves are a visual feast, 45 distinct characters, from helmeted heads to bees in flight, arranged in 61 groups that spiral inward like the coils of a serpent. Some scholars believe this radial structure hints at a ceremonial purpose, perhaps a hymn to the Minone mother goddess, whose serpentine figurines have been found in temple repositories. The repetition of certain signs, a walking man appearing 7 times, a shield cropping up in rhythmic intervals, suggests poetic meter or incantation. Imagine a priestess turning the disc as she chants, each rotation summoning a different aspect of the divine. Others propose more pragmatic theories, a royal decree, a trade ledger, even an early board game. But without a bilingual key or parallel texts, these interpretations remain speculative, like trying to reconstruct a symphony from a single bar of sheet music. The disc's isolation raises deeper questions about the Minones themselves. This was a civilization sophisticated enough to build multi-story palaces with flush toilets and vibrant frescoes of leaping dolphins, yet they left almost no decipherable written record of their beliefs. Linear tablets deal mostly with inventories, olive oil, wool, and wine, while the Phaistos disc's imagery pulses with potential sacred meaning. A bee, a creature sacred to the Minones and linked to their goddess Potnia, appears multiple times. A tiara-like symbol echoes headdresses worn by priestesses in Minone art. Could this be a liturgical text, a set of instructions for rituals performed in the palace's central courts, where bull-leaping ceremonies once enthralled crowds? Modern attempts to crack the code have veered from the scholarly to the fantastical. Early 20th century researchers tried linking the script to Basque or Etruscan, languages as enigmatic as Minone itself. Computer algorithms have parsed the symbols for statistical patterns, suggesting it might encode a syllabic language rather than logographic one. One controversial theory even posits that the disc isn't Minone at all, but an import from Anatolia, its script a foreign tongue lost to time. The most haunting possibility, though, is that the disc represents a writing system so experimental, so ahead of its time that it died with its creator. What lingers isn't just the mystery of the symbols, but the disc's eerie craftsmanship. Whoever made it didn't carve the signs, they stamped them, using prefabricated seals to imprint each character. This technique wouldn't reappear in Europe for another 3,000 years with Gutenberg's printing press. Was the Phaistos disc a one-off experiment, a fleeting spark of innovation snuffed out by the volcanic eruption that devastated Minone civilization? Or does its twin, its Rosetta Stone, still lie buried beneath Crete's olive groves, waiting to whisper the secrets of a goddess who once ruled the waves? For now, the disc spins silently in Herakleon's archaeological museum, its spiral arms outstretched like an invitation or a warning from a world we'll never fully know. In the misty forests of 4th century Germania, a bishop named Ulfilas performed an act both revolutionary and dangerous. He translated the Bible into Gothic, the tongue of a people the Roman Empire called barbarians. This wasn't just a linguistic feat, it was a theological grenade. Ulfilas's version, the first Bible in any Germanic language, didn't align with the Nicene Creed, the empire's official doctrine. Instead, it reflected his Arian beliefs, which saw Jesus as subordinate to God the Father, a divine being but not co-eternal or equal. To the Goths, this emphasis on Christ's humanity made faith feel accessible, a savior who'd walk the earth as they did, not a distant, unknowable deity. But to the Roman Church, it was heresy, a threat so dire that when the Nicene faction triumphed, Ulfilas's Bible was hunted down and burned, its fragments surviving only in palimpsests, pages scraped clean and rewritten with Orthodox text. The irony is thick enough to carve with a dagger. Ulfilas, the grandson of Cappadocian Christians captured by Goths, had been sent back to his ancestors' homeland as a missionary. His translation, crafted using an alphabet he invented to capture Gothic's guttural rhythms, wasn't meant to divide but to bridge. The Lord's Prayer in his rendering, Ata Ansar Thu in Himmanum, resonated with warriors who'd never heard scripture in their own voice. Yet this very accessibility became its undoing. Arian Christianity, with its human-centered Christ, spread like wildfire among the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards, precisely the barbarian tribes Rome both feared and relied on for military might. When these groups sacked Rome in 410 and 455, they did so as Arian Christians, their faith branding them as double threats, invaders and heretics. The Church's suppression of Ulfilas's Bible wasn't just about theology, it was about power. The Nicene Creed, with its insistence on Christ's full divinity, reinforced a hierarchy where the Church mediated access to the sacred. Arianism's simpler, more intimate relationship with Jesus bypassed that control. Gothic warriors didn't need priests to explain a savior who'd bled and hungered like them. Surviving fragments of the Codex Argenteus, a 6th century copy of Ulfilas's work, reveal subtle edits where scribes altered phrases to align with Nicene orthodoxy. The famous Son of God passage in Mark originally read, "the only begotten God," emphasizing distinction, not unity, a nuance scrubbed from later versions. What's lost in this theological tug of war is the cultural bridge Ulfilas built. His Bible didn't just transmit religion, it preserved Gothic identity. The language he codified outlived the Goths themselves, influencing Old English and Norse. The very act of translation rendering abstract Greek concepts into the earthy metaphors of a warrior culture was an act of respect. When Ulfilas called Jesus a Theoden's chieftain rather than Kyrio's lord, he rooted the divine in terms his people understood. Today, the Codex Argenteus sits in Uppsala's library, its silver ink glinting like the ghost of a faith that once united tribes and terrified empires, a testament to how easily the victors of history erase the voices that don't fit their story. High in the Himalayan valleys of Kashmir, where snowmelt feeds ancient rivers, a spiritual revolution once flourished, one that saw the human body not as a prison for the soul, but as its most sacred temple. The tantric texts of medieval Kashmir, like the radiant Vajnana Bhairava Tantra, mapped consciousness through breath, sensation, and the subtle interplay of energies. These weren't just philosophical treatises, they were manuals for enlightenment, teaching practitioners to channel desire itself into divine awakening. Yet when British colonialists and Victorian scholars stumbled upon these scriptures in the 19th century, they recoiled, not at their complexity, but at their frank celebration of the sensual. What the Kashmiri masters had refined over centuries as a path to transcendence became, in Western hands, little more than pornography in saffron robes. The distortion began with translation, or rather mistranslation. Sanskrit terms like Maithuna, ritual union, were rendered as orgy, while Shakti, cosmic energy, became female seductress. The tantric concept of embracing worldly experience to surpass it, what scholars now call the path of immersion, was twisted into proof of Eastern decadence. Sir John Woodroffe, writing under the pseudonym Arthur Avalon, tried to correct these misconceptions in his 1918 book, Shakti and Shakta, but even he couldn't fully shake the Orientalist lens. Victorian morality filtered every passage through its own obsessions. When the Kulanava Tantra described ritual wine as a symbol of liberated awareness, missionaries saw only heathen drunkenness. When the Kala tradition honored women as embodiments of wisdom, colonizers dismissed it as primitive goddess worship. What got lost in this moral panic was the Kashmiri tradition's profound psychology. The Vajnana Bhairava's 112 meditation techniques include savoring the aftertaste of fear, tracing the path of a sound into silence, even dissolving into the space between thoughts, methods as sophisticated as any modern mindfulness practice. Abhinavagupta, the 10th century polymath whose commentaries systematized Kashmir Shaivism, framed Tantra as the art of radical presence. Wherever the mind alights, he wrote, there the infinite shimmers. This wasn't hedonism, it was alchemy, transforming base experience into gold through sheer awareness. The real tragedy wasn't just the exoticization, it was the silencing of a living tradition. Kashmiri Pandits, the keepers of these texts, were marginalized first by Mughal rule, then by British policies favoring Brahminical Hinduism over Tantra's radical egalitarianism. By the time Western seekers rediscovered Tantra in the 1960s, its Kashmir roots were often erased, repackaged as generic Eastern mysticism, stripped of historical context. Today, as scholars like Bettina Bayuma collaborate with surviving Kashmiri practitioners to retranslate the texts, a startling picture emerges, a lineage that anticipated modern neuroscience by a millennium, mapping chakras not as magical energy centers but as metaphors for layers of consciousness. Perhaps the greatest irony is how contemporary spirituality has come full circle. Modern trauma therapy's emphasis on somatic awareness echoes tantric body-centered practices, while neuroscientists study meditation's effects on brainwave coherence, precisely the phenomena Kashmiri mystics documented in poetic verse. The whispers of those medieval sages, once drowned out by colonial scorn, now resonate in labs and therapists' offices. Their real scandal wasn't sex, it was suggesting that enlightenment might be found not by renouncing the world, but by diving into its very heart. Across the vast red deserts and lush coastlines of Australia, an intricate web of knowledge stretches for thousands of miles, not written on parchment or stone, but carried in song. The Aboriginal songlines, known as dreaming tracks or yeri in some languages, are more than just stories. They're living maps weaving together geography, astronomy, and sacred lore into melodic pathways that have guided Indigenous Australians for over 60,000 years. Each verse, each rhythmic phrase corresponds to landmarks, a rock formation, a waterhole, a mountain range, encoding directions so precise that a trained singer could navigate hundreds of miles through unfamiliar terrain simply by recalling the lyrics. But when British colonizers arrived in the late 18th century, they heard only primitive chants, dismissing these complex navigational systems as childish myths. What they failed to grasp was that they weren't just witnessing songs, they were standing before an oral library of ecological wisdom, one that science is only beginning to appreciate today. At the heart of every songline is the concept of the dream time, the epoch when ancestral beings like the rainbow serpent or the seven sisters traveled the land, shaping rivers, mountains, and stars through their journeys. These creation narratives aren't metaphors but practical guides. The Pitjantjatjara people's songline for the honey ant, for instance, describes the creature's path in such detail that it pinpoints underground water sources in the desert. The Yolngu people's Moonbone song tracks tidal patterns along the northern coast, predicting fish movements with lunar precision. To sing these verses isn't just to recount a story, it's to activate a survival manual, one that links generations through rhythm and repetition. Anthropologist Bruce Chatwin famously described them as a symphony of knowledge, where every note holds meaning beyond melody. Colonization didn't just disrupt these traditions, it shattered their continuity. With indigenous communities forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands, the songlines fractured like broken mirrors. A Warlpiri elder might know the verses for their territory, but lose the stanzas that connected them to neighboring groups, severing networks of trade and ceremony. Mission schools banned children from speaking their languages, cutting off transmission. Yet even in fragments, the songline's resilience astounds. In the 1970s, when anthropologist Ronald Berndt worked with Arnhem Land elders to map the Jankowoo Sisters songline, they recited verses describing coastal features that hadn't been visited in generations, features later confirmed by satellite imagery. The songs remembered what the people had been forbidden to see. What modern science now recognizes is the sheer sophistication of this oral cartography. Songlines don't just describe static landmarks, they encode dynamic relationships. A verse might note that when the acacia blooms, emus will gather at a certain bend in the river, signaling it's time to hunt. Another might link the rising of Orion to the arrival of monsoon rains. This isn't poetry, it's data science, a millennia-deep record of ecological patterns that Western researchers are only now documenting as climate change alters the landscape. In 2019, a study published in Ecology and Society found that songlines of the Martu people in Western Australia contained fire management practices that prevented wildfires and promoted biodiversity, knowledge honed over thousands of years of observation, now being revived to combat modern bushfires. The true tragedy of the songline's fragmentation isn't just cultural loss, it's the silencing of a world where humans aren't separate from nature, but participants in its rhythms. Unlike European maps that reduce land to lines and ownership, songlines embody reciprocity. To sing the country is to care for it, to know it as kin. Today, Aboriginal communities are painstakingly reassembling these fractured melodies, using archival recordings and elder testimonies to stitch the threads back together. In the Kimberley, the Wanambal Gombera people have revived songlines to guide conservation efforts, proving that these ancient scripts aren't relics of the past, they're blueprints for a future where knowledge isn't stored in books, but carried in the breath of those who remember. And perhaps that's the most radical lesson of all, that a library can live in a song and a map can be written on the heart. History never truly erases, it just layers new meanings over old, like parchment scraped clean and rewritten. These 28 sacred scripts, scattered across time and geography, reveal a haunting pattern. The moment a civilization falls, its holy words become clay in the hands of conquerors, scholars, and power brokers. Colonialism didn't just burn books, it reshaped their very souls. The Mayan Dresden Codex, dismissed as demonic by priests who couldn't fathom its celestial mathematics, or the Vedas, their egalitarian spirit smothered under caste hierarchies, both show how sacred texts become battlegrounds for control. When new rulers can't erase, they reinterpret. The Assyrians didn't destroy Babylon's Enuma Elish. They simply swapped Marduk's name for their god Ashur, turning a creation epic into political propaganda with a few strategic edits. But erasure isn't always deliberate. Sometimes meaning crumbles simply because the voices who understood it fall silent. The Rongorongo glyphs of Easter Island or the Olmec Cascadule block aren't just undeciphered, they're orphans, severed from the communities that once breathed life into their symbols. Linguistic decay sets in like dry rot. A generation stops teaching the old tongue, a scribe's shorthand becomes indecipherable, and suddenly a prayer becomes a puzzle. The Etruscan Liber Linteus, sliced into mummy wrappings by people who saw only linen, not liturgy, embodies this slow fade. Words don't vanish in flames, they dissolve in the quiet erosion of time. Yet here's the paradox: sacred texts are astonishingly resilient. Like seeds dormant in desert sands, they wait for the right conditions to sprout anew. Modern technology is now the shovel unearthing them. Multispectral imaging peels back layers of palimpsests to reveal erased Gothic verses. Linguists use AI to cross-reference symbols in the Phaistos disk with Linear A, teasing out patterns invisible to the naked eye. Indigenous communities, from the Maori to the Warlpiri, are stitching songlines back together using archival recordings and elder memory. Even the Gnostic Gospels, buried for 16 centuries, found their voice again when a farmer's shovel struck that clay jar in Nag Hammadi. What's emerging isn't just recovery, it's reckoning. Scholars now see these texts as palimpsests of power, their layers revealing who controlled the narrative and why. The Dead Sea Scrolls, once misread as apocalyptic prophecies, are now understood as rulebooks for a community that chose purity over empire. The tantric texts of Kashmir, reduced to exotic erotica by Victorian scholars, are being reclaimed as sophisticated maps of consciousness. Each rediscovery cracks open assumptions about history's winners and losers. The Druids, maligned by Rome as bloodthirsty cultists, emerge as philosophers who saw divinity in oak groves and river bends. This isn't just about the past. These resurrected scriptures challenge modern monopolies on truth. The Aboriginal songlines, with their ecological precision, question Western divides between science and spirituality. The Jain Agama's radical ahimsa pushes us to expand our circles of compassion beyond humans. Even the Manichaean Psalms, long vilified as heresy, offer a vision of darkness not as evil but as unfinished light, a notion that could soften today's polarities. The lesson woven through all 28 texts is clear. Sacred words are never static. They breathe, adapt, and sometimes go underground, but they don't die. Whether fragmented like the Liber Linteus or hidden like the Gnostic Gospels, they endure, waiting for the day when someone listens closely enough to hear their original pulse. And that day, it seems, is now. These 28 scripts are more than relics, they're mirrors reflecting the fragile dance between power and belief. Think of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, its spells once guiding souls through the afterlife, reduced to curiosities in museum cases, or the Popol Vuh, its hero twin's journey rewritten to fit a friar's theology. Each time a civilization falls, its sacred words don't just fade, they're reshaped, weaponized, or buried beneath new dogmas. Yet somehow, against all odds, fragments of their original voices persist, whispering through the cracks of history. What's striking isn't just the loss, it's the resilience. The Gnostic Gospels spent 16 centuries hidden in a jar, only to resurface and upend assumptions about early Christianity. The Slavic Vedas, though likely forged, filled a void so deep they became scripture for a people desperate to reclaim their past. Even the Olmec Cascadal block, its symbol still mute, taunts us with the possibility that somewhere a key still waits to be found. These texts defy the idea that history belongs solely to the victors. They prove that meaning is never fixed, only borrowed, contested, and sometimes, if we're lucky, rediscovered. This isn't just about ancient words, it's about who gets to decide what's sacred, what's true. When colonial priests burned the Borgia Codex, they weren't just destroying paper, they were erasing a way of seeing time itself as divine. When Christian scribes sanitized the Poetic Edda, they replaced cyclical rebirth with linear judgment, altering not just stories but worldviews. The real question isn't what was lost, it's what might we still recover. For every text we've deciphered, how many others lie in fragments, mislabeled, misunderstood, or locked away in vaults? Consider this an invitation not just to marvel at these scripts, but to listen for the echoes they leave behind. The next time you hear a chant, read a myth, or even glance at a faded inscription, ask yourself, what deeper truth might be hiding beneath the surface? And if you could hold one of these lost texts in your hands, which would it be? The answers might surprise you. After all, the past is never really past. It's just waiting for the right moment to speak again. So dive into the comments, tell us which of these scripts resonated with you, or share another example of a forgotten text that deserves its voice back. And if you've enjoyed this journey through the shadows of history, hit that subscribe button. There are always more stories to uncover, more whispers waiting in the dark. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, every word we've ever written carries the ghost of 1,000 others left unsaid.